So hi everybody, my name is Tyler Rohrabaugh. I'm really excited for you to be here today. When I started thinking about this talk, it's because the fact it's come around from about many years that I've been in cybersecurity. So I'll get into it in a second, but first let's kind of give you a background. I'm Director of Technical Business Development for Palo Alto Networks, and one thing is I also work on the new platform that you can consider Demisto, which is the SOAR platform that's out there. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a little story. That is why I'm calling this talk Pandora's Box, and some questions that I ask CISOs and directors of security when I go in and set up SOAR systems, and other questions I've been asking for the last almost 17 years now that I've been in cybersecurity. And what we're going to talk about then is some information around what risk is. And how many of you are directors of security or security analysts or CISOs in the room? Can anybody here just raise your hand really quick? Great. So one thing is that what my opinion might be a little bit different than what most in this room considers, things from a risk standpoint. And then we'll also talk about something called FAIR. Is anybody in the room familiar with what FAIR is? Great. That's good. Which is basically FAIR is a risk model, and we'll get into what that actually is. We'll start talking a little bit about briefly what MITRE ATT&CK is, which I assume most people in the room know what MITRE ATT&CK framework is. Yes? Great. Good. And then I'll briefly talk about SOAR, because I'm sure that everybody here in the room has probably heard a great deal of information around SOAR as a whole. It's security orchestration and automation response. And then we'll talk about how to model a scenario using FAIR, actually, and ATT&CK and SOAR combined in order to better improve your cybersecurity strategies for dealing with incident response and things like that. And then we'll go through some questions. And as I said, I kind of want to start out with a little story first. So as I mentioned, I've been in the industry now for almost 17 years, and I have held a variety of different roles in cybersecurity, ranging from everything from pen testing, red team, engagement with physical security systems, to I worked with one of the first log management systems you probably heard of called ArcSight. Built a lot of the software, or helped build a lot of software that was there. And I ended up actually at ArcSight through an acquisition that built one of the first incident response and automated threat response systems for the government, for the U.S. government. And as my career kind of went on, I would walk into every single company that I went into, and I would ask CISOs and directors a couple very basic questions. And the reason I called this talk Opening Pandora's Box is because the fact that as I asked these questions, the responses that I got were really just very interesting to me in general. And the reason I asked these questions in the very beginning is I had no idea why I asked these questions. It was just something that came to me naturally. I think it was because, as a kid, I kind of was like a little hacker and would, break into stuff and things like that. But I think as I kind of grew through my career, the reality was I was asking these questions, not asking myself why I'm asking these questions. And I think that as any good security analyst or CISO, director of security, you need to ask questions about your security programs. You need to ask questions around what you're doing from a security posture standpoint. And what's really important about that is what questions you're actually asking. So I have a question for everybody here. What do you think one question I asked every CISO or director over these multiple years that I've been in security? Give me one good question that I asked. Anybody? Just one? One question. Any question at all? Go ahead. Asset management, that's a good one. Okay, so we'll kind of touch base on that a little bit, but let me go through what these 4 questions are. And the reason why I want to go about this is because I think you'll see how this kind of ties back into what we talked about in the agenda. And the first question that I asked every CISO and director of security that I walked into is, what is the largest cybersecurity risk to your organization? Now, I asked this question to hundreds of chief security officers over my career. And over the last 3.5 years or so, I actually spent time working in the SOAR, what I call SOARlandia, which is kind of like a joke for a movie called Narnia. And the thing is that when I asked this question, there was responses that were kind of really interesting. And I'll show you an example what some of those are. But I want you to just think about this question for your organization really quick. And if I came to ask you this, would you have an answer? Okay. Now, number two, as you mentioned, which is good, what are the assets that hold the most value in your organization? Okay. Now, this question I think is extremely important. And I think that we don't really ask it enough. And I think that a lot of time, people, when they think about this question, they start thinking about servers and stuff. And what's interesting is the responses, which I'll get into for this really quick, is that I would get stuff like, we don't know where all of our servers are. Okay? That's not actually an answer to the question I asked. Right? But it is important. That's good. I got, well, we don't have our servers up to date or they're not patched. Well, okay. But these are chief security officers and directors of security that were telling me this. Okay. Well, after that, then I would get things like, well, we don't know how many assets we have in an organization. We have an asset management or a CMDB. But the fact of the matter is that most of the stuff that's in our organization is not in that CMDB. Okay, cool. But the question I was asking is, what are the assets that hold the most value in your organization? And I kept getting answers that didn't align with the question. So then I would think to myself, am I asking the wrong question? And I don't think so. It took me 17 years and enough courage to get on the stage in front of you guys, and men and women in the room, to turn right around and say, I think I'm actually asking the right questions. So let's get it to number three. If blank was breached, if somebody did actually respond with a particular asset or set of assets, I said, if blank was breached, how do you respond today? Now this basically question here, I got the best answer I've ever heard in my career, which was, Tyler, that is exactly why we want you to come on board and help us. Or we want to hire you from a professional services engagement, or when I did contracting work, we want to bring you on board here because you know the best practices. That's great. That doesn't answer the question. And I think this is a pretty decent question to ask. So if we start thinking about when we talk about assets, for example, we start talking about, what I'm mentioning here is if blank was breached, how do you respond today? And I wasn't getting really good answers here. I was getting things like, well, we actually do things in a manual way. Or we use Excel spreadsheets. Okay, well, we have a run book or a playbook. Great. How do you do that today? And they're like, well, it's written down in a policy. All right, that's awesome. That's written down in a policy somewhere. That's great. But do you update that policy? And they're like, well, once every couple of years, or once every year when we do an audit or compliance check. Okay. But, this is basically the third question I ask every CISO director walking in the room, okay? Number four was, if blank was breached, what is the financial or reputational loss that could occur? Now, how many of you have ever thought from a security standpoint an answer to this question? Now, if you're a CISO, I would hope that you should. But as I said, that's kind of why the name of the talk is Opening Pandora's Box, because what I'm really trying to do is every CISO director or security analyst that's in the room, I really want you to think about this in depth. If something was breached in your organization, what is the financial or reputational loss that could occur? And the answers that I would get here is a wide range of things. Well, we have no way of tracking what the financial impact is of a breach to our organization. I'm sorry, but I don't believe that. And I know that that can be calculated. And if you're not doing that, you should be doing that. Now, the next question I'm going to ask you is, how do you think that they responded? Anybody? Over 40% of the people that I talked to through my entire career literally gave me this look. Okay, they would scratch their head. And they would turn right around to me and they'd say, well, Tyler, we really don't know. As I said before, they would ask me, well, what do you think? Why are you asking me, whether I'm a vendor or contract or whatever shirt I'm wearing for the week, basically, why would you ask me when you're the person that should tell me exactly what it is that, we should be responding to, whether it's a post-breach incident or it's during, new use cases you want to build for your SOAR program, or firewalls that you want to implement, or if you want to do a red team, vulnerability assessment, et cetera. You should be telling me basically what it is that you consider the most important things, and I shouldn't have to really give you that information. Okay, now this is for anybody you're working with, contractors, professional services, whatever. And I understand it's going to happen, but I'm just saying to you, this is basically how most of the CISOs and directors that I worked with responded. I only obtained one really, really, really good answer. And this is pretty much, I'd say, in my entire career, from any organization so far, when I asked that first question, what their greatest risk was. This is the answer that I got from one organization. We know, they said, Tyler, we know exactly what percentage and where the financial losses come from. They come from fraud events. And I was blown away because I was like, in my entire career, I was just trying to get an answer to one question for an organization. And when they answered this, I said, this is great because any vendor on the market, anybody who's in professional services or contractor can take that and say, oh, their biggest problem, their biggest risk from a financial perspective is fraud events. Therefore, we know what to sell them. We can build an entirely new product and even market it like Spectacular from Moulin Rouge, the movie. And we can actually sell them something or build them a solution around this. Because we know that basically all of their particular types of financial losses are coming from fraud events. However, if you don't know this as an organization or a CISO or director of security, you should. And if you tell me that you don't have enough data or information in your organization to actually measure this, I'd love to have a conversation afterward, because I think you do. And you can gather that information from all of the systems that you already have at your fingertips. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to talk a little bit about risk and what people think risk is. Because as I said, through my career, I kind of asked these simple 4 questions, and I would get a wide variety of answers that were kind of all over the map. And for me, why I'm asking this is because to me, security does come down to a level of management of risk, okay? And I think any CISO in the room or director of security would probably agree with me that there's some level of risk you need to understand for everything. So to me, risk equals loss exposure. And in business, that generally means financial loss. So when you take anything that you're doing from a security posture standpoint or anything you're doing from a security analysis work, you need to really, I think, look at things from a perspective of, from a risk perspective of whether or not this impacts the organization from a financial loss perspective. If you're not doing that, then what you're working on is really technically cool, and it's something of value, I think, and it's something that you need to think about. But at the same time, if it doesn't impact the bottom line or impact the financial loss of the business or the liability risk for the organization, then the reality is that your impact is great and it's useful, but it's not as large of an impact as if you're going after the things that could impact the financial loss for the company. So when you're thinking in terms of risk, I have a question for anybody in the audience really quick. Is the password that we all make fun of, and I've done it too, because I've done red team and pen testing for a long time, vulnerability management. Is this password we've all seen on those sticky notes that we've all made fun of and say, this is stupid, how could you ever do this? Is this password an asset or control? Can anybody answer this for me really quick? Now I know it's kind of a gray area, I've thought of this too, but there's a reason why I asked this question. So we got this sticky note, you're going in some office building and it's sitting there, it's the password, the Wi-Fi, whatever it is. Is that sticky note, an asset or control? Okay. Nobody? Anyone to take a guess? Okay, that's good. All right. So let's just say for this conversation, we'll consider an asset. Now you could consider control. I think depends on that. That's why I said by gray area. But the thing is if the password opens the door to this, janitor closet, for example, then in terms of risk, it's probably not an asset, right? But I will say, I do happen to know some hackers like, Jason Street or Chris Roberts, for example. And yeah, they could probably use some chemicals in the room to blow up the building. Or they could actually use, for example, maybe there's leftover janitor's clothes in there that they wear to go throughout your building and take everything in your entire building. However, for the purpose of this, what we're discussing here, though, let's just think of it that password, if it did open that door, was probably not an asset to the organization because there's no real financial loss that could occur from that particular password being lost, right? But if the password opened a door to an energy plan or shut it down, then someone somewhere, maybe even your adversary, would definitely consider that password to be an asset. Everybody in the room agree to that? Okay. So if a password is an asset from a risk perspective, the thing is, like I said, I ask a lot of questions, is are you concerned about the passwords or the places and the data and the applications the passwords provide access to, or about the effects or the loss or the financial loss that could occur? If you're not asking that, when you're going through these activities, whether it's red team, pen testing, vulnerability management, or if you're doing from a log management perspective and looking at events, or you're doing security orchestration, automation response, you're building out use cases, you're building out new run books or playbooks for things that you're working on, and you're not thinking about that, then that's something you should be really thinking about, okay? So when you think about risk, you must be crystal clear on what you consider an asset, okay? So as we were talking about earlier, like assets to me don't necessarily mean servers. An asset could be a person. It could be a place, a location. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't necessarily need to be an actual server. So without being really crystal clear on what you consider an asset, we can't think, or we're not able to think about or calculate the potential or probability of loss exposure. And the reason I'm pointing all of this out is because as you kind of start to work on your cybersecurity program, start to improve your cybersecurity program, I think what is extremely important as you start to think about what you consider an asset, doesn't necessarily have to be some sort of asset like a server, but the assets that are the most valued to your organization and what those financial losses could be. And then you can, at that point, then you can start to actually measure things and start to take metrics. Now, we're all doing this. We're all starting to take metrics about how many events something's occurring, et cetera. But are you tying those in and organizing those with the actual financial losses that impact your organization? Because you probably, if you're not, you probably should. So let me get kind of into back into this original story that I was talking about when I said opening Pandora's box. Now, my joke is that I was originally going to come over here and list out all of the CISOs and directors of security that I was going to talk to, but that's probably a career-limiting move, so I won't do that. But what I will say, though, is that I think these 4 questions that I'm asking and this discussion about risk is very important. And I think as you start to kind of add new tools to your your security operations centers and things like that, you really want to start to prioritize things from a risk posture standpoint, if you can, at least from the CISO and the director of security level. So when I mentioned and talked about opening Pandora's box, what I want you to think about for a second is that when Zeus created Pandora's box as a gift, and that Pandora's box was opened up, all of this evil kind of flowed out of it, right? And the reason I think that's important is because when I sat there and I went through my career and I started looking at things, I said, I'm asking these 4 questions, I'm not getting really good answers. Is this because I'm asking the wrong questions, or is it because I'm asking the right questions that really nobody has good answers to? And the more and more I dug into this, the more and more I realized that evil things just started coming about this. I started looking at things differently from a security standpoint. I started instead of looking at things from, oh, this is vulnerable to X all the time, I started looking at things from a, oh, wait, what is the risk of this particular situation or this particular asset? What's involved with this particular risk? So as Pandora's box is open, it kind of like all of the evil kind of spreads out like lava pouring through everything's path. And the cool thing is that that's kind of how loss flow works for an organization. Now, if you're a CISO or director sitting in the room, you should know this, and I'm pretty sure you do. But the reality is that a threat actor or threat agent basically takes action against some sort of asset in your organization. It doesn't have to be a server, it could be a person, right? And that would be considered that's basically impacts a primary stakeholder in your organization. And the effect of that, the effect of that basically hits the primary stakeholder, which then the next downwind or downstream effect is affecting the secondary stakeholders. And of course, who have then a reaction, and then that reaction towards some sort of asset, for example, and then that then affects the primary stakeholders. Let's take a very simple example what that is. So if you have primary stakeholders and secondary stakeholders for organization, the reality is that the secondary stakeholders are what is going to impact financially the financial liability for your organization. And why is this important is because let's take something like reputational loss that could really financially impact your organization. So that comes from your secondary stakeholders, which in effect are your customers. So you get a breach, and then what happens is that you call in a team, or somebody finds out that you're vulnerable to X. The reality is that then that secondary stakeholder, which is your customer, will then turn right around and start either a particular lawsuit or something like that. So what type of loss flows are there? Basically, for risk frameworks like FAIR, for example, which we'll get into, loss for both primary and secondary stakeholders include things like loss in productivity, which is a financial loss. Response costs, like, for example, how long it takes your incident response team to actually take action in hours or days or weeks. replacement cost for whether it's a particular asset like a server, for example, or something like that. Your competitive advantage lost from a financial standpoint. Any level of fines and judgments, which I'm sure some people have been impacted maybe by GDPR. I have seen that in Fortune 100 companies globally. And the next thing, of course, as I mentioned, was reputational damage from a financial standpoint. So as you start to go through those 4 questions I asked, the reason what was surprising is that either A, everybody does know the answer and just doesn't want to mention it to me because maybe they have a risk ledger or something like that and they just don't want to discuss it. Or they don't know and they really don't want to admit that. And that's okay, I understand it. But what I'm mentioning here is that those loss flows, it's important to understand those. So if you know what those are, that's good. If you don't, then you should. Because that way you can kind of start to align what you're doing from a cybersecurity program standpoint directly with the financial liability risk for your organization. So now that we've kind of gone into this and what we're diving into is this, from the story standpoint, how I've kind of moved into thinking of situations and things like that from a risk perspective and less about how an organization could be vulnerable to X or they can be breached at any given time in that kind of situation. Let's talk a little bit about FAIR. And there's a variety of different cybersecurity risk frameworks that are out on the market. The problem with them in general, I think, and there's all models have problems, is that risk models are, basically risk models in the past in a lot of cases are generally, how do I put this, a very simple methodology to use. And I want to kind of briefly touch bases for that. You see, how many in the room, if anybody's willing to answer this, I'd like to see this, but measure your, basically a threat that you're seeing, for example, as a low, medium, or high risk. Okay, thanks for admitting that, I appreciate that. So the question I have for you then is, if you measure something based on low, medium, or high, and the person sitting next to you thinks that low, medium, or high means something different, you may have a lookup that you guys do at the same time or whatever it says, this is low and that means X. But if you're not actually measuring that based on, say, like probability or based on a number, then the reality is your low and somebody else's low could be completely different. So you're looking at something as a low, medium, or high risk, but the reality is who's considering that low, medium, or high may be completely different. This goes all the way up to the board from a CISO level, does it not? I mean, that's kind of how it works. You are talking with your organization, you're saying, well, that's a high risk from a vulnerability standpoint, or our breach we consider a very high threat. That could cost us a lot of money in our organization. But what you consider high and what that person may consider high may be completely different unless you have a number that's associated to it. And so what FAIR does and what a lot of these newer risk model frameworks do is they allow you to measure things from not just a metric standpoint, but allow you to measure things based on probability of occurrence. And so FAIR stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk. It's something I definitely would recommend anybody in the room who is not familiar with this from a risk standpoint to take a look at it. And when you start to think about what risk is, as I mentioned, and in the model framework, I'll get into how this kind of works in a second. But you want to think about information that you gather in your organization and things like that. What is more important is accuracy over precision. So I kind of have this little diagram on the far right-hand side over here. Is that you can have a high degree of precision but not be accurate at all. So what I mean by that is that in FAIR, and I'll kind of explain this process, but the thing is that whether you use FAIR or you create your own risk model or you use another type of risk models out there, my suggestion that I want you to kind of walk away with really quick is that it's very important to think of things from a estimation standpoint. So as you start to measure low, medium, or high risk, the thing you want to really consider is this a low, what is the probability that this is actually a low risk? What is the calculation that you came up with from a low risk standpoint? How did you derive that this is low? It doesn't matter if it's coming from all of the different security tools you have or you're kind of making that assumption yourself, or maybe it's based on events that you're pulling in from your log management systems or your SIEM, et cetera. But you need to really think about that. And so it's important because it's about collecting information that you have in your organization, and accuracy from that is better than just being precise. So you can have a number that says we're 3.2.9 or 3.29652 whatever percent probability that this chance of something could occur. That's great. That's very precise, but that's not necessarily accurate. You need to explain basically how you're being accurate at gathering information that you're doing for organization, especially when it comes to risk management. So in FAIR, I kind of like to explain things as recipes. So the reality is that if you think of like recipe like a beer recipe or drink recipe or something like that, or like a recipe around cooking, for example. You could think of FAIR basically as one part ontology or taxonomy, one part risk terminology, which I think that if you're in cybersecurity, if you are a CISO, you may be familiar with some of these terms, but there's things like threat event frequency, loss event frequency, basically contact frequency and probability of action, these kind of terms. Most cybersecurity analysts aren't as familiar with these terms. And I think it's very important because if cybersecurity analysts and the teams understand how risk is measured within the organization, it allows them to better make decisions that they're not able to do today based upon a particular threat occurring versus just saying it's a high risk. Oh no, we need to call everybody under the sun because it's really not that high risk towards our organization. So the other thing, it's one part data gathering, one part probability and normalized distribution. So you could think of this from your basic statistics 101 class from a normalized distribution sample from that standpoint. And then that is actually made up of what I call a half part of a formula called PERT, which is broken down into 3-point estimations, which is, as I mentioned before, instead of low, medium, high, it's actually spread between a most likely to least likely and minimum probability that this particular event is occurring or has occurred in the past. And then half part of Monte Carlo simulation. So if anybody in the room is a mathematician, that's cool, because I think that I'm not. But the big thing here is to think about what you're doing is taking your entire metrics that you're gathering and all of the information you're pulling out of all of the different systems you have. You're applying that through FAIR, and then you're sticking that through something that's called a Monte Carlo method. And what that allows you to do is outcome of what the probability of occurrence are through a distribution. Okay. So let's kind of briefly talk about FAIR's taxonomy really quick. What you have here is risk starting at the top, and then the two most important things to walk away with right now is what you should be doing, if you're not already doing it, is thinking about the loss event frequency and the loss magnitude for any level of breach that has occurred in your organization today. So if you have a malware incident that occurred, you should start thinking about how many times that malware incident occurred or has occurred in the past for your organization. If you're saying you have never seen it in the past, I have a hard time believing that. Okay? Now, what is also very important is to think about the loss magnitude. How much did that cost you, either in time, resources, or in actual company loss, secondary, like I said before, primary, secondary holders losses. So if it was, for example, reputational loss, they want to think about that loss magnitude. So maybe it was the CISO or the CEO's laptop was stolen, for example. So if that's the case, then what you want to think about there is what was the actual loss magnitude? Maybe it was nothing. Okay, so then the question is, do we prioritize use cases and things that we start taking action against based on whether or not that loss magnitude, which was 0? Well, no, we should still kind of do something about it, but it's a matter of prioritizing that versus, oh, somebody hit our customer database, pulled out all of our customer records and stuck all of that on Payspin or on some other site, right? So from there, you can break down loss event frequency to the threat event frequency, which we all collect in this information. Vulnerability here in this case, by the way, really quick, is in FAIR's model, is actually not we're vulnerable to X, Y, or Z. It's a probability of vulnerability. And what that means is that there's a big difference there. That means how vulnerable are you to what is the probability that you're vulnerable based on a particular type of vulnerability. And then, of course, you can kind of see the other ones of these different types of other information you need to gather, like contact frequency, what is the probability of action, threat capability, for example, and the difficulty. And then, as I mentioned, for loss magnitude, as you see here is primary loss and secondary risk, or I call it secondary loss, but you then need to think about what is the secondary loss event frequency and secondary loss magnitude. Now, really, the reality of what I was saying is just the two most important ones to kind of walk away with here is loss event frequency, loss magnitude. Because I do think that given all of the SIEMs and log management tools that you have today in your own existing infrastructure, you can calculate that. You can pull that data. You've got a bunch of EDR platforms and things like that. You can pull all that information. Okay, now I'm not going to go through this, but the thing is that this is, in essence, kind of the process that you use in FAIR. And what it does is that it allows you to kind of take what I said in the very beginning is kind of, think about an asset, for example. Think about the threat community that's involved there, and then you start going through what you see from that ontology and taxonomy that I had before, and you start to break that down into gathering all of the information from a probability of occurrence standpoint. And when people say this is too hard to do, what I have a tough time understanding is, well, what you're doing on a daily basis by hunting, threat hunting, or what you're doing from a response perspective or going through all of your log management is extremely hard. So I think that you should actually take the time to actually pull out some of this information or get your analysts to start gathering this information because otherwise, what you're doing is not necessarily calculating the actual financial loss that particular event is occurring to your organization. So as you see here, we grab all of this information, and then what we do is when you put that into a model, then we actually can start to determine what the probability of risk is or the loss exposure is to your organization. It's kind of a slimmed down model, but which you can get from a book called Measuring and Managing Information Risk. And I think it's extremely important to kind of take a look at that book because they also have training classes, stuff like that on FAIR. But that's not the end goal of this talk is really getting into that. It's just to kind of briefly discuss what FAIR is. So after you start gathering all of that information, my joke is that you kind of stick all of that into what I call the FAIR blender, which really what it does is you take all this, it comes out with a bunch of numbers, and at the end of it, after it puts it through the Monte Carlo simulation, it comes out with what you see on the kind of the top right-hand corner over here, which is a distribution graph. And then from there, you can kind of start to understand what the probabilities of the low, medium, and high are from a probability standpoint, at which point then you start to understand what your costs are. So wait, let's just stop for a second, okay? This all seems really complicated. Well, the thing is that what I'm trying to get here is very important around these 4 simple questions I asked in the very beginning, is that the goal of FAIR and risk models is actually to communicate in terms of risk in reality to basically business people. And I think that's very important because even chief security officers and directors of security, sometimes we have a difficult time to actually go out and communicate what the actual risk is to an organization. However, if you turn right around and say this could cost us a potential impact of $5 million, the reality is I'm very sure, or 5 billion or whatever it is, or complete loss organization, I'm very confident that your CEO or the board of directors would turn right around and say, well, make it happen and fix it today. Whatever the cost is going to be less to fix it than it will be for us to take action against that. Okay? All right. Now that we've talked about FAIR briefly and that it's a risk model, what I want to talk about next is MITRE ATT&CK, and I'm only going to go over this briefly because it seems like everybody in the room understands what MITRE ATT&CK is. All right. MITRE ATT&CK is a blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go into the whole white paper discussion around that because, like I said, I like talking about recipes and stuff, right? So to me, really, it's an attack or threat taxonomy and ontology once again. And it's one part tactics, one part techniques and procedures kind of mixed up into what I would call a coverage matrix. And my joke for today is if anybody's ever seen the movie The Tron, it's kind of like that. It's the grid. It's like the attacker's frontier is my joke. And basically what it is that they stick all of this into this big grid. And in my book, what it is allows you to start to understand what different techniques and tactics are and procedures what can impact your organization. So we've got a FAIR model, which allows you to do risk management. And we've got basically MITRE ATT&CK model, which allows you to do techniques and tactics and techniques and procedures. And a quick example of that you can kind of see here is you've got an ID, which gives you a number for that MITRE ATT&CK. Gives you a tactic for initial access, for example, some detection and mitigation and procedures, for instance, that you can do from how you can detect it or mitigate it from that standpoint. So I'm going to jump into another topic real quick, and you'll see how I'm going to tie all these together in a second. So we talked about FAIR from risk model. We talked about MITRE ATT&CK, and you've got TTPs that basically you can start to kind of model and understand coverage for your organization. And next we're going to talk about SOAR, and SOAR basically it stands for Security Orchestration Automation Response. And when you start thinking about SOAR, what you're doing is you're collecting all this information in organization. You start collecting information around all the events that are occurring throughout your organization. And with a security orchestration and automation platform, what you're able to do is collect that information from any of these tools. And then you are basically going to start to interact with all the different security tools that you have in your organization and start to do automated level of responses or proactive measures like blocking it using panorama firewalls and things like that, right? So you have the FAIR model for doing risk management, you have MITRE ATT&CK for understanding your coverage, and then you have SOAR, which allows you to do automated response and take actions against events of information you're collecting. So the thing we want to start to think about is okay, how do we start to glue this stuff together? Because when I talked about opening Pandora's box in the beginning, we've got all this kind of evil flowing around. It's impacting our organization from a financial perspective. What we want to start to think about is, can we glue these three together? So after you kind of have this and you can enrich and respond, do all this other stuff with SOAR, what you end up having from that is the result is, in essence, just a playbook that allows you to run through all the different tasks that you need to do within your organization to accomplish use cases that you're trying to go for. So let's think about that. From a SOAR perspective, the goal is to do automated response and to take remediative action or preventative automated actions and things like that. And we do this using playbooks and tasks that are either with human intervention or without human intervention. And when we start to kind of deal with playbooks in general, we start to think, okay, we got to define these use cases. So let's go back to what we talked about with FAIR. We need to define what the risk is first. We need to find out what types of MITRE attack techniques and tactics and procedures apply to the use cases that we need to be prioritizing for a response team to actually take action and start to actually build out these use cases. So what we're going to go into is start talking briefly about modeling risk scenario with FAIR and attack and SOAR. So if we want to model a scenario, going back to what I was talking about, FAIR, MITRE attack, and SOAR, the first thing we want to do is determine the asset at risk. Then the next thing that we should do is start thinking about the threat community and profile, okay? We need to start thinking about the threat type and the capability and the effect of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then we want to apply then the FAIR model, as I mentioned, with threat events, loss event frequency, and the ontology that's used for FAIR. And then we want to apply the associated MITRE attack TTPs. And then we want to determine the priority of building use cases or playbooks for your SOAR response activities based on the results of that. Okay? So a very simple example on the right-hand side is I talked about like a CEO's laptop being stolen or something like that. So here we have an asset which I will use an example as like a server in this case, but it's an employee or corporate laptop or endpoints, for example. And the threat community could be cyber criminals. I won't say hackers because I don't really believe that they're the same. Threat type, for example, would be malicious activity, and the effect could be confidentiality, and then we could say, here's the associated TTPs, that's associated TTPs that are linked to this, right? In this case, you see there's like T1192, for example, for a MITRE attack technique. So then what we start doing is we start gathering information from our organization. We say, okay, has this happened in the past? Because it probably has. And we can say, okay, how many times did our malware systems detect the malware is found on internal systems, for example. And then what you'll come up with is week 1 through 6, you may have a bunch of different numbers of how many times you've detected malware that's ended up on internal systems. And then what you'll say is, okay, you see where it says malware vulnerability. What you have here is maybe you've collected the information from perimeter systems like firewalls, et cetera, and then, or you've collected them from internal detection system or endpoint systems. And then what you're able to do is say, okay, well, what's the total event frequency that occurred? And how many loss events occurred from that? So did you lose any information? Did you lose any customer data, any records for your customers, or any kind of, maybe, if you have intellectual property or other types of things that you've lost? And then you could say, okay, well, the probability of vulnerability is X percentage from that, right? So once we start to break that down, what you see is the summary where it says malware vulnerability per week. This breaks down to minimum, most likely, and maximum, for example, in percentages. And then what you're able to do is start to calculate based on that what those actual losses are going to be. So here's kind of a very quick, dirty example of it. But depending on the FAIR results that you have for those minimum, most likely, and maximum costs, the attack techniques, and basically the attack TTPs, associated coverage, and basically the FAIR model results that we've obtained, then what we can do is we can start to prioritize the responses accordingly. So if you take a look over here, what I'm trying to show you is that this is what you would see as manual intervention costs. Now, I would ask any CISO in the room, maybe not here, but later at some point, what is the average per hour cost that you find from a forensics investigation? I bet it's actually a lot higher than this, in all honesty. But I have seen it to be roughly around 100 to 150 an hour, depending on the consulting you're trying to deal with. So if you think about that, you've got amount of person hours that it costs. You have the amount of forensics cost that it has, and the total cost. So now if we look at that through a weekly or over a year time period, et cetera, you can start to break this down and say that the manual intervention costs were a minimum of $100, for example. the most likely was $100, or the maximum was $7,500, and that's per event. Now let's say you had 10 events per year, that's $70,000. Okay, maybe that's not a big deal, but then you start saying, okay, well, if that $70,000 or that maximum that was just on that single event were to occur over X percentage, X amount of time, then that could cost your organization severely a lot amount of money, or you should start to kind of understand the probability of that occurring at a much larger scale if it would be a larger breach. So an activity from a security orchestration automation response perspective is to really think about this from a use case prioritization standpoint. So you've got FAIR, you did your risk modeling, then what you did, you started looking at the TTPs and use case you're going to go after. And then what you start thinking about is the SOAR activities that you need to really do. And so my suggestion here is to start saying, okay, let's develop and tag response process that we use, for example, and prioritizing those use case playbooks. To tie back to those MITRE ATT&CK techniques, basically TTPs, and also think about how to tie that back to the risk perspective from a loss exposure, and thinking that when you have, say, one use case which could be like phishing, for instance, yes, that may be coming in as the most greatest particular attack to your organization, but it may also not be. Maybe your greatest loss you've had in the past, or you think from a risk perspective is actually not that. It's intellectual property loss. Then you ought to look at maybe better securing or analyzing your data loss prevention program. So from here, then what you can do from a prevention and detection standpoint is design automation, automated detection assistance and process for that, for example. Update automatically any detection prevention system like blocking automatically or firewalls and things like that. And then also you can start, another activity for this would be looking at your post-breach processes and start determining time-consuming or manual intervention process that you're doing today. So if you're looking at this from a cost perspective, financial liability risk perspective, then what you're able to say is, okay, how much time are these manual interventions occurring? How much time is that actually costing us? And if it's costing us X amount of time, then we should really start prioritizing our use cases around that. And then automating, reducing cost of those manual interventions, as I mentioned, and then collecting evidence to determine how to improve the risk loss exposure and the overall magnitude. So if you're not really collecting that evidence today, then you should be, because my bet is what a lot of organizations do is just collecting everything in SIMs and log management systems, but you're actually not tying that back to the original risks that you're calculating for in your risk ledger, or if you're actually measuring risk, from any liability risk from any standpoint at all, then you should basically look at that. So a very simple example is I went in one organization and they did in fact have breaches from phishing, for example. So they prioritized that highly because of the fact that they said that they were getting the most financial loss from that, from a phishing instance, for example. So what you would then do is take this, for instance, and build out your playbooks and your SOAR products accordingly, and start to prioritize those use cases based on that as an example. So in summary, what I'm kind of trying to get at here is I mentioned those 4 questions. I really think that if you're a CISO or Director of Security here, you should really think about those 4 questions about risk, understanding what a FAIR model could be, for example, and how to apply that to your organization. Understanding that you can apply the MITRE ATT&CK framework to your organization, and also SOAR program, and tying all of those together in order to prioritize use cases for organization. And the reason I'm saying this is because I really think it's important to spend time on from your incident response team's perspective on lowering and raising the priority of use cases that you're going after from that incident response perspective. You may be, if you start prioritizing based on risk, then what you're able to do is not just say it's a high, medium, or low risk, but the probability of that actually occurring or the financial impact to your organization. Then what you can start doing is saying, we're actually working on the right things from an incident response perspective, versus saying, well, we just should go after what we see as the most events. But those events may not actually be impactful from a financial loss perspective to your organization at all. So then the other questions, as I mentioned, you can start saying, okay, do we automate this or not? Because the cost may be actually cheaper to not automate than it is to automate, or in some cases maybe a lot, basically more efficient to automate something, because the amount of time it takes to automate it over time, just get the low-hanging fruit out of the way. So that we can do that as well. Gathering, determining, basically gathering what types of automation and response metrics to obtain. And then determining if those responses that you're actually actively working on, like phishing or whatever, align with those TTPs and the FAIR estimates that you're actually doing. Because if you're not, like I said, tying these to the attack techniques and tactics, techniques, procedures, or your financial liability risk for your organization, then you have use cases that you're working on that are not applicable to the liability risk for your organization. And then you can also ask some questions like, is the attack and SOAR coverage we have for this risk enough to reduce the risk or loss exposure, financial loss that could occur? And that to me, is very, very important, because I think, as I mentioned around like phishing, these different types of use cases, if you're just going after those and thinking that these are the highest priority ones because you're picking them out of a hat, I think that's a wrong approach. And finally, as I kind of mentioned before, the original topic of this was opening Pandora's box, and as you kind of see, what happened is I evolved this from a security standpoint into a risk standpoint. And the reason I was talking about Pandora's box is because if you actually go through and understand the story behind Pandora's box, the reality is that as everything kind of left Pandora's box, and the bottom of Pandora's box was kind of like a note that said hope. And the thing I want to give you really quick around that is that my hope for you is that you really kind of take what I'm mentioning a little bit, go back to your homes or whatever it is, and think about things from a risk perspective and financial liability risk perspective for organizations or entities, whatever you work with. And instead of just saying, oh, this is vulnerable to X, or we need to protect against these particular things, if they're not tying it to loss exposure to your organization, then you're really kind of spinning your cycles, and you're not really thinking about how to prioritize, how to effectively improve your cybersecurity program. So that's kind of what I want to leave you with from a hope perspective. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I have nothing else.